Hello and welcome. I'm Steve Clemons, contributing editor at The Hill. Thanks so much for joining us today for our annual Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Summit. I'm happy to be joined by my new co-pilot for the day, Cheyenne Daniel. She's The Hill's new race and politics reporter. Cheyenne, welcome to Washington. I'm looking forward to seeing your coverage. People should sign up for it. Good to be with you.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Look forward. We're going to be joined by lawmakers, by business executives, innovators, policy experts, for a meaningful discussion on steps that could lead to change and create a more inclusive country. What more can be done to break down barriers to equity and achieve true inclusion? How can we provide and promote opportunities for innovation in all communities? And it's going to be a tough job to do this. We have to have no illusions that this is easy. I'd also like to thank our sponsor, Qualcomm, for its support of today's event. Before we get underway, a few housekeeping notes. You can tweet us at The Hill Events, at that little curly Q thing, at The Hill Events, using the hashtag #TheHillDiversity. We're broadcasting live and we'll take your questions throughout the program. Our first guest is Congressman Derek Kilmer. We've talked to Derek before. He's the chairman of the House Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress. His committee was tasked with trying to fix Congress during this very divisive political environment and make it more transparent and inclusive of its constituents and, frankly, also of its workers. Congressman Kilmer, it's great to see you again. Thank you for joining us. Look, what did your committee, the ModCon committee, achieve, and what's left to be done? We'll just get right to the bottom line.
For sure. Well, already our committee has passed 194 recommendations focused on making Congress work better for the American people. And it's ranged from, and on top of that, our committee decided we didn't want to just make recommendations. We actually wanted to make change. We're sort of like that fake Saturday Night Live commercial about the bank that only makes change. We make change. It's what we do. About 2/3 of our recommendations have actually either been implemented or are on the path toward implementation. Again, because we want to make the place function better. Some of the things have been focused on restoring power to the legislative branch, things like the community project funding, which is now part of the appropriations process. Some of it's been focused on, again, I guess two things germane to your conversations today. Trying to figure out how in a legislative body where there's a lot of division, we encourage collaboration, but also how we as an institution bolster the capacity of the institution. And that means doing a better job of recruiting, retaining, and having more diverse staff within the institution.
And how is that going? I mean, I know that equity was a key pillar of President Biden's commitment and campaign when he came in. And I've seen that, to be honest, within, various appointments he's made. But I just love, kind of an honest talk, because sometimes we see only the surface of things. When you get beneath it, are those opportunities real? Are you finding people come in and feeling empowered? And once you're seeing this inclusion, are you seeing kind of a new melting pot? Are you seeing people kind of accept this? I mean, I just want to get into the tectonics of it.
Yeah. Let me give a handful of examples of recommendations our committee made, some of which have already been implemented, and that I think will have a really positive effect on the institution. And let me say up front, part of the importance of diversity, equity, inclusion within the institution of Congress is Congress and its staff should look like the American people. It will do a better job of being responsive to constituents if it does. So one of the recommendations we made, as an example, was making permanent an Office of Diversity and Inclusion within the institution. That was actually implemented in the last rules package. And it means you now have an entity, an office within the Congress that goes to bed at night thinking about these issues every evening and wakes up every morning thinking about these issues. On top of that, and this gets at some of your question around, where are things landing? Is it making a difference? To some degree, you achieve what you measure. And one of the challenges within the institution is historically a lot of this data, the demographic data around who's working in the institution, just hasn't been kept. And so one of our recommendations, again, which has been implemented by the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, is to do surveys, to look at anonymized demographic data, to look at who's coming to work in the institution. And then beyond that, trying to ensure that congressional offices have tools to expand their recruitment to, again, make sure that they're recruiting staff that looks like the districts. One of the challenges that we observed when we started off on this exercise was Congress in many respects is 435 independent contractors, all with their own HR function. And so everybody was kind of winging it. And so we recommended the creation of a one-stop shop human resources hub for members, for committees, for leadership staff that can provide information around how to build a more diverse staff, that can provide tools around the HR function.
Right.
Most successful organizations have something like this. And our recommendation was it was time for Congress to have that too. That has been implemented, and I think will make a difference.
Congressman, another thing you've been working on is related to the CHIPS Act. I want to get into it. And I'm going to tell folks, he's not everybody's favorite guy, but Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock, made an interesting statement I heard once where he said, I don't want to just get Harvard Business School types, because whether they are people of color, not of color, they essentially have become homogenized and have had an experience that is largely similar. And so to break out of that blind spot, he wants people with very different life experiences. Sometimes that's defined by gender. Sometimes that's defined by race. Sometimes that's defined by socioeconomic group or geography. And so I'm interested in Washington State and some of the things you've been kind of focused on, which is how certain industries have just died and left generations of people behind. And you're involved with something that's kind of very funny, folks. I had to read it here, which is the Recompete Act, which was part of the CHIPS Act, called the Rebuilding Economies and Creating Opportunities for More People Everywhere Act. I'm wondering if there's an AI program that you just pump this stuff into, to get the words out that come out. So it's there. But tell us a little bit about the Recompete Act and CHIPS, which I know is about competitiveness, but because a lot of people look at technology right now as the villain in the story when it comes to diversity or inclusion or people. Tell us how you're trying to make it an ally.
Yeah, let's start with a couple of problem statements. One, right now you have about 30% of the American population living in communities that are economically distressed, that have been largely left out of economic growth, left out of jobs, left out of opportunities, left out of investment, that has otherwise been seen largely in a handful of major metropolitan areas in recent decades. I represent a district that is not Seattle and is not Silicon Valley, and yet part of the reason this discussion has been included in the CHIPS Act, which is a competitiveness bill, is out of an acknowledgement that if we are going to compete as a nation, we can't leave some of our best players on the bench. We have to make sure that everybody who is capable, regardless of what zip code they live in, regardless of their socioeconomic status, regardless of any other demography, is able to have a shot and is able to participate. And listen, I grew up in a town that was a mill town, and I represent a district that used to export wood products all over the world. And in some of those communities, there's a real fear now that their main export is going to be young people. And so the idea behind the Recompete Act was to actually have some place-based economic development, to use the Economic Development Administration to provide some long-term and flexible grant support, really focused on trying to close the employment gap, what's called the prime age employment gap. And it can be used for everything from basic infrastructure needs to workforce development to small business assistance, really with an eye towards understanding that if we are going to compete as a nation, it can't just be Seattle and Silicon Valley and Boston and our major urban centers that are growing the jobs and opportunity, that we have to have all of our best players on the field. And that includes distressed logging towns in Washington or distressed mining towns in West Virginia, or other areas where people without some help really are at fear of being left behind.
Well, Congressman, one of the other dimensions here is, whether it's our friends at Qualcomm, whether it's a lot of other places, is a concern about how do you upskill America and at scale? How do you take people? Because right now, we still see technology racing forward so quickly, but America has some wobbliness. It has some wobbliness in terms of the human talent side of this, the upskilling side of it. How do we make technology an enabler of our choices rather than a disabler? How do we begin moving in this direction? I know the CHIPS Act and competitiveness were a part of that, but I think a deeper question is, what sorts of human sensitivities are we building into the technology question to make sure that upskilling and diversity and inclusion in that upskilling challenge are like solid and core to this effort?
Well, specifically in the technology industry, something that we've worked quite a bit on is trying to expand access to computer science education and making sure that those opportunities are available to all students, regardless of race, regardless of socioeconomic status. If you look at a lot of the data, particularly related to computer science, there is not equity in those opportunities. If you look at some of the data behind, for example, taking the advanced placement exam, um, it's disproportionately white students, it's disproportionately male students. And so part of the work that we've done in the CHIPS Act and elsewhere is really having some intentionality about expanding those opportunities to students of color, to more female students, to ensure that there's science, technology, engineering, and math opportunities for all students. Listen, not every job is going to require a STEM education, but we do know that more and more jobs are requiring at least some STEM education. Beyond that, a lot of the work that you've seen come out of Congress in recent years has been focused on things like the House has passed for the first time in decades a reauthorization of the National Apprenticeship Act.
Right.
I actually put forward an amendment in that bill to have an inclusion of STEM apprenticeship opportunities and computer science apprenticeship opportunities. Again, not every job opportunity is going to require an advanced degree, and so looking at the apprenticeship pipeline is another avenue. And then finally, I'll just say we also have to we have a few challenges. We have people who need jobs. We also have jobs that need people, and there's a bit of a mismatch. One of the things that we've seen piloted in states like mine is more avenues for incumbent worker training opportunities where employers can actually invest in their existing workforce and upskilling them. We've seen things like lifelong learning accounts, which are optional tax advantaged benefits where an employer would pay in, an employee would pay in, and the worker could use it either to take night classes or to go pursue a new professional certification, or if they got laid off, to go get retrained. And just out of acknowledgement that we have an incredibly dynamic economy. And to me, part of the value, one of the areas of focus for the federal government ought to be figuring out how do we empower workers to navigate that economic change rather than to be victimized by it.
Right. Real quick, Congressman, I know that you talk to your colleagues across the aisle. I know you have that project. You co-sponsor things on their bills, you on theirs. So there's some communication there. I'm just interested that if your GOP colleagues were to take the House and come back, where does this topic go? Where does diversity and inclusion go in a GOP control? Do they unplug the efforts? Does it remain on the roster? What's your sense?
I mean, it's a better question for them than for me. I will say, I think by and large, the American people are ahead of Congress and recognize the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Thankfully, you've seen in recent years Congress wake up to the importance of this. I think it is good news that all of the recommendations that I just mentioned related to diversity, equity, and inclusion that came out of the committee that I chair were bipartisan. And there are others in that space that were bipartisan. And so my hope is that you would see a continuation of these policies within the Congress, not just for Congress as an institution, but the importance of recognizing that our competitiveness as a nation depends on having all of our best players on the field.
Well, Congressman Derek Kilmer of Washington State, he is chair of the House Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress. Thank you so much for joining us today.
You bet. Thanks for having me.